August 7, 1942. Dawn breaks over Solomon Islands like a fever dream. Mist rising from the ocean, the jungle trembling with the cries of unseen creatures. The waves roll heavy against the shore of an island few Americans had ever heard of before that day. Guadalcanal. For the first time in the war, the United States is on the offensive. The first boots splash into the shallows, rifles held above heads, helmets gleaming in that eerie gray light that lives between night and morning. The men, mostly Marines barely out of their 20s, had no idea that they were about to enter one of the most brutal environments on Earth. They were trained to fight man. Instead, they would find themselves fighting nature itself. What they didn't know was a half a world away. In a gray war room in Berlin, their landing would soon echo like a ghost story to the ranks of Hitler's army. At first, the Germans laughed. To them, the Americans were factory soldiers, boys raised on Coca-Cola, Hollywood, and prosperity. Not bred for endurance like the Germans, nor hardened by imperial discipline like the Japanese. The Americans, they said, could build machines but couldn't stomach mud, could shoot from a distance but couldn't crawl through the filth of war. But Guadalcanal would change that perception forever. When the first landing craft touched the sand, the men saw nothing but a wall of green, a jungle so dense that sunlight itself seemed to vanish. The heat was suffocating, the air heavy with rot, and the smell of unseen things dying. Flies gathered on their faces, and the noise, the eternal buzzing, the croaking, the drumming of unseen wings, felt like a living thing pressing against their skulls. The island was alive, but not in any friendly way. Everything crawled, everything stung, everything bit. Within hours, the Marines were drenched in sweat and mosquito bites. Within days, many were already sick, fevered, trembling, vomiting. And then came the enemy. The Japanese Imperial Army was already dug in, hidden, patient, lethal. They had been trained for this kind of war, to live off the land, to strike from nowhere. They believed that the Americans, pampered and soft, would never last. But what followed shocked even the Japanese commanders themselves. The Americans did not break. They improvised. They learned. In the first week, their rations spoiled in the tropical heat. Their supply ships were driven off by Japanese air raids. For nearly 2 weeks, the Marines were stranded on the island, surviving on captured Japanese rice, half-rotten coconuts, and rainwater caught in helmets. A diary recovered later from a Japanese officer contained a single line that seemed to sum up the disbelief of the enemy. The Americans fight like devils in this jungle. They're supposed to be weak, but they do not stop. That line was copied and transmitted up the chain of command, eventually finding its way, through Axis intelligence channels, to Germany. Somewhere in Berlin, a colonel read that report and frowned. He had expected stories of American collapse. Instead, he read about their persistence, mud-caked, starving, half-dead men who refused to surrender an inch. The irony was almost cosmic. While Hitler's troops were freezing on a Russian steppe, the Americans were roasting alive on a Pacific island, both sides enduring hell in opposite climates. But only one of those armies was learning from it. The Guadalcanal campaign lasted 6 months, and in those months, the jungle became the great equalizer. Corporal John Basilone, one of the many young Marines there, later described the nights as a place where the dark itself seemed to move. The Japanese attacked in waves, often at night, screaming through the trees with bayonets flashing. Machine guns lit up the jungle in short, violent bursts, the muzzle flashes revealing eyes and shadows and chaos. Rain fell constantly. Boots rotted. Rifles jammed with red mud. Corpses decayed so fast the air itself stank of death. Yet somehow, the men adapted. They learned to fight by sound instead of sight. They learned to sleep in bursts, eat when they could, and never, ever trust the quiet. The jungle was not just an enemy. It was a teacher. In November 1942, a Marine wrote in a letter home, "Mom, I thought I came here to kill Japs. Turns out, the islands try and kill us first, but we're learning her tricks." That learning would terrify the Germans later, because while the Americans fought, the rest of the world watched, especially the Axis. Japanese reports sent to their German allies described the Americans not as soft, but as unyielding. They spoke of units fighting without supplies, of men carrying on despite malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion. One Japanese message intercepted by Allied intelligence described the U.S. Marines as wild men who fear no death. That same transmission was later analyzed by German officers studying Japanese field communications. For the first time, the Wehrmacht saw an American army that was not just mechanized, but primal. There's a strange truth about war. Environment shapes evolution faster than doctrine ever could. At Guadalcanal, evolution was happening in real time. The Marines arrived as clean-cut recruits. They left as hunters. They had learned to move silently through vines and mud, to ambush, to stalk, to survive on almost nothing. They became soldiers of instinct, not theory. One veteran later said, "Guadalcanal stripped us of civilization. We became what we had to be." By the end of the campaign, over 60,000 Americans had cycled through the island. Roughly 7,000 were dead. The Japanese lost more than 30,000, many not from bullets, but from starvation and disease. Entire regiments disappeared into the jungle without trace. The land itself seemed to consume men. Graves could not be dug fast enough. In some places, bodies were buried under inches of mud, only to reappear days later after heavy rain. The Marines joked darkly about the island that eats everything. Even humor became a survival mechanism. One sergeant quipped that the mosquitoes ought to be given medals. They drew more blood than the enemy. Another called Guadalcanal the only place where you can smell death before breakfast. But beneath the dark laughter, something had shifted. The Americans, those same soft factory soldiers, had learned to thrive in a place that should have broken them. Reports from Japanese officers captured after the war mentioned their disbelief. One noted, even when surrounded, they continued firing. Even when starving, they advanced. Back in Europe, the German High Command began to take notice. German intelligence files later discovered in Berlin contained references to Guadalcanal as a proof of American adaptability. One German officer was recorded as saying, "If they can fight like this in the jungle, what happens when they come to our forests?" It wasn't fear yet, but it was the seed of it. Meanwhile, on the island, life was reduced to the simplest elements. Eat, drink, fight, survive. Malaria infected 2/3 of the men. One medical report from the 1st Marine Division recorded over 8,000 cases of tropical disease in a single month. Still, combat continued daily. The enemy attacked relentlessly at night, screaming in the dark, often to the sound of drums. The Americans answered with mortars and machine guns. Afterward, the silence was worse than the noise. The jungle swallowed the echoes, leaving only the hum of insects and the distant lapping of waves. It was in that silence that the transformation occurred. Guadalcanal wasn't a victory of strategy. It was a victory of will. The Americans began to see themselves differently. No longer the underdogs, no longer the inexperienced recruits of 1941. They were now veterans forged by misery. When reinforcements arrived months later, the new men looked at the survivors with awe. They were thinner, quieter, harder. Their eyes had the faraway stare of people who had seen something that could never be explained. They didn't brag. They didn't need to. Word of the battle spread slowly but steadily. Newspapers back home spoke of heroic Marines and the turning tide in the Pacific. But the headlines couldn't capture the reality, the mud, the hunger, the madness. Nor could they capture what was happening in the minds of the enemy across the world. Because even in Berlin, the legend of Guadalcanal was growing. The Germans were listening. Japanese envoys reported back to their Axis partners, describing an enemy that could no longer be underestimated. For a military culture built on the myth of racial and national superiority, this realization was profoundly unsettling. In one German staff meeting, a Japanese attaché reportedly told his hosts, "The Americans adapt faster than we expected. They fight without fear of death." To which a German major allegedly replied, dryly, "Then we should hope the jungle stays on their side." It was a rare moment of humor, but one that hit a creeping anxiety. Because by 1943, it was clear that Guadalcanal had not just been a battle. It was a transformation. The Americans had entered believing that technology and training could win wars. They left believing that only endurance could. They had discovered something the Germans didn't expect them to have: patience. Patience to starve, to bleed, to rot, and still move forward. As one Marine later said, "We went into that island as soldiers. We came out as animals. But we survived, and that's what scared them." Somewhere in Berlin, that fear began to grow, a quiet, private fear among officers who had once mocked the United States as an industrial giant without spirit. They began to wonder what would happen when that industrial power met experience, when mass production met instinct. The jungle had taught the Americans how to suffer, and a soldier who can suffer cannot easily be defeated. By the time the last shots were fired in February 1943, the U.S. had secured its first major victory against Japan. Guadalcanal was theirs, but the cost was measured in sweat, disease, and memory. For the men who left, the jungle never really let go. Many would later describe hearing the sound of rain and being transported back to those nights. Mud in their boots, the smell of rot, the sound of unseen footsteps in the dark. And far away, in Europe, men in gray uniforms were reading those same reports with quiet dread. They had thought the Americans would wilt under tropical heat. Instead, they had found a nation that learned to thrive in hell. And though the German army would not meet them face to face for another year, the image of those jungle fighters lingered. The Americans had proven something that statistics alone could not: that even comfort-born soldiers could become predators when the world demanded it. The legend of Guadalcanal would not stay in the Pacific. It would travel, through whispers, through intelligence memos, through nervous conversation, to the heart of Berlin. And what it told the Germans was simple: the Americans were no longer beginners. They were coming. But what came next would shake the Germans far more than they could imagine. Winter 1943. Berlin. The city is gray, the air thin and cold, the streets scarred by years of war. Inside a sealed building near the Tiergarten, a group of German officers huddle around a radio, their cigarettes glowing faintly in the dark. A Japanese transmission crackles through static, a voice speaking of annihilation, of jungle ghosts, of an enemy that will not die. The officer in charge, Oberst Hans Kruger, listens in silence. The words are halting, broken by static, but the message is unmistakable. American troops still hold Guadalcanal. Our forces decimated, unable to retake island. Kruger exhales slowly. For months, German intelligence had been receiving reports from their Japanese allies. At first, these were filled with confidence. Talk of American weakness, of untrained soldiers, of inevitable Japanese victory. But now the tone had shifted. The reports had become frightened. A nation of mechanical soldiers, the Germans had been told, had learned to fight like animals. The room remains silent for a moment after the transmission ends. One of the officers mutters, "It's only the Pacific. What concern is it to us?" Kruger doesn't answer right away. He looks at the map on the wall, a vast spread of red pins marking German advances across Europe and North Africa, and then at a small note clipped near the edge of the Pacific Ocean. Guadalcanal. He taps the paper thoughtfully. If they can do this in jungle, he says quietly, they can do it anywhere. For the first time, doubt seeps into the German officer corps. For nearly a decade, they had believed the United States was a nation too young, too spoiled, too comfortable for total war. Hitler himself once dismissed the Americans as mongrels of money, incapable of the spiritual hardness that war required. The Germans respected industrial might, but not the men who operated it. But Guadalcanal changed that. The Japanese, Germany's most disciplined ally, had been defeated not by clever strategy or overwhelming numbers, but by sheer endurance. It was an unsettling revelation for Berlin. In early 1943, as reports from the Pacific accumulated, the German military began quietly studying American behavior in combat. Translations of Japanese field notes and captured American diaries circulated within the OKW, the German High Command. One Japanese officer's report from Tokyo described it bluntly. They fight without food. They repair their weapons with wire. They march through swamps without orders. Their spirit does not break. Kruger's superior, General Alfred Jodl, summarized it in a briefing. They are learning the art of war in the most difficult school, the jungle. We must assume they will bring that experience to Europe. It was not an official fear, not yet, but it was a whisper that grew each month. By mid-1943, German soldiers on the Eastern Front had begun to hear rumors of American toughness. At first, they laughed it off. How could soldiers who lived in luxury survive what the Wehrmacht had endured? But among officers, the mood was different. They understood something their men didn't, that morale and adaptation were the true currencies of war, and the Americans had both. In a captured Japanese dispatch dated December 1942, a field commander wrote, "They attacked through the storm. We thought them finished. They advance again. We no longer understand this enemy." Those words, when translated in Berlin, sent an uncomfortable shiver through analysts accustomed to hearing of American cowardice. There's a peculiar irony here. Hitler's Germany, the self-proclaimed master of discipline and endurance, was learning from its own ally that another nation had surpassed them in the one thing they prided themselves on most: toughness. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all was this: the Americans had learned it from nature, not ideology. In the jungle, survival had no politics. It demanded adaptation. And adaptation was something America excelled at. While the Germans built fortresses of doctrine, the Americans built flexibility. By the time Guadalcanal ended in February 1943, the U.S. military had absorbed lessons that would define the rest of the war: logistical improvisation, medical evacuation, small unit tactics, and above all, endurance under psychological collapse. To the Germans, reading about it from afar, it was as though they were watching a rival species evolve overnight. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels dismissed the American victory publicly, calling it a sideshow in a swamp. But privately, his diaries betray unease. In an entry from March 1943, he noted, "The Japanese setback is disturbing. The Americans appear capable of suffering greatly, and yet remaining functional. This is not to be ignored." It was not the kind of sentence one wrote lightly. Meanwhile, the Germans were struggling on every front. Stalingrad had just fallen, Rommel was in retreat, and Allied bombing was now reaching German soil. Amid that chaos, the last thing they wanted to hear was that their newest enemy might be far more dangerous than expected. But evidence kept coming. Captured Japanese officers spoke with quiet shame about losing to the Americans. One, interrogated after the war, said, "They were like the jungle itself. You could kill one, and another would grow in his place." That sentence found its way into a German intelligence summary, circulated later in 1943. By then, the Germans had begun analyzing not just American equipment, but American psychology. They noted how U.S. troops were well-fed and equipped, yes, but how they also maintained morale through humor, camaraderie, and rotation. To the Germans, this was baffling. Their own soldiers were expected to endure without relief, to break or die. The Americans rotated their men, preserved their sanity, and yet fought as fiercely as anyone. Kruger, the Berlin intelligence officer, once remarked during a briefing, "They laugh even in combat. It is unnatural. They do not know they should be afraid." Someone in the room replied dryly, "Or perhaps they do and fight anyway." That, more than anything, was what frightened the Germans most. Fear that the Americans had found a balance between comfort and courage, a mixture that Germany's rigid ideology could never produce. As the Pacific reports continued, the term jungle warfare began appearing in Wehrmacht intelligence documents as a shorthand for unpredictable American tactics. They spoke of U.S. units that advanced silently, fought at night, used terrain to their advantage, traits the Germans had once associated only with elite commandos. And the irony deepened when those same tactics began showing up in Europe. By the time the Americans landed in North Africa in late 1942, they already carried the psychological residue of Guadalcanal. Veterans of the Pacific were now training others. By the time of D-Day, many of the techniques refined in that jungle, the emphasis on endurance, small unit leadership, improvisation, were standard U.S. doctrine. The Germans didn't know it then, but Guadalcanal had been their first warning. One Wehrmacht field report from France, 1944, recorded after clash with U.S. infantry near St. Lo, included a striking observation. They moved through the woods as if they were born there. They crawl, they flank, they vanish. The officer who wrote that had never been to the Pacific, but his description sounded eerily familiar. Guadalcanal had followed them. It's strange to think that an island thousands of miles away could haunt men who never saw it. But it did. It lingered in the imagination, a symbol of an American army that had learned to become feral when it needed to. Even among captured German soldiers, later interrogated by Allied forces, some admitted a grudging respect. One said, "We thought the Americans were merchants, but they fought like hunters." Another, a tank commander captured in Normandy, confessed, "We had been told they feared discomfort, but they crawled through mud and smoke like beasts. They did not stop." There's an almost poetic justice in it. The Germans had built their war machine on mythology of endurance, discipline, order, the iron will. The Americans, they believed, lacked that core. Yet in the jungles of the Pacific, that myth was shattered, not by grand speeches or ideology, but by mosquitoes, rot, and the simple will to live another day. And perhaps that's why Guadalcanal scared them so deeply, because it proved that endurance was not a matter of race or ideology. It was human, and the Americans had embraced it faster than anyone thought possible. By 1944, when Allied bombers were darkening German skies daily, that fear had become reality. Hitler himself, in one of his late war conferences, mentioned the Americans with rare seriousness. "They are not the same men who ran in North Africa," he said. "They have learned something new. They are dangerous. Dangerous not because of their weapons or numbers. Germany still produced formidable tanks and guns, but because of their psychology. A soldier who can suffer, adapt, and keep fighting is the most dangerous kind of all." In the ruins of Berlin 2 years later, that prophecy would come true. But for now, in early 1943, the Germans only had the stories, the whispers from the jungle, the captured notes, the Japanese voices crackling over the radio describing devils in the vines. And sometimes late at night, officers like Kruger would imagine them. The unseen enemy crawling through the tropical dark, the sound of rain, the flash of a rifle, the silence that followed. It was easy to laugh at such things in daylight, but harder, perhaps, when the lights went out. Because even if the Germans never set foot on Guadalcanal, the shadow of that island had already reached them. It reached them in their briefings, their intelligence memos, their dreams. It whispered that somewhere across oceans, a new kind of soldier was being born, one who would one day cross the Atlantic and bring the war home. And when that day came, in the hedgerows of France, in the forests of Hurtgen, in the frozen fields of Bastogne, the Germans finally met them, the same breed that had survived Guadalcanal. They fought with the same patience, the same endurance, the same quiet ferocity that had once stunned the Japanese. To the Germans, it must have felt like the jungle had followed them to Europe. In the end, Guadalcanal was not just a battle. It was an initiation, a transformation. It taught a young, industrial nation how to fight without mercy, how to adapt without rules, how to endure without reason. And when the Americans finally reached Europe, that transformation became Germany's nightmare, because the Germans had spent years preparing for machines. But they were not ready for men who had learned to become something more than soldiers. They were ready for everything, except the jungle. And in every forest, every field, every ruined city that came after, the echo of Guadalcanal followed. The sound of rain, the hiss of leaves, the relentless footsteps of men who had once learned to survive in the green hell. Men who had learned, in that distant corner of the Pacific, how to be unstoppable. And that is why, long before Normandy, before Bastogne, before Berlin, the Germans had already begun to fear the Americans. They feared them not because of their strength, but because they had learned to love the struggle, and that in war is the deadliest lesson of all.